So now without any further delay, I'd like to hand it off to your first presenter today, Chris Baldwin. Chris, you have the floor.
Thanks, Greg. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation today. My name is Chris Baldwin. I'm a program manager on the SQL Server Reporting Services team. Today we're going to be talking about some of the things that we've done in the July CTP of SQL Server 2008 that make reporting services more of an enterprise reporting platform. So some of the objectives and takeaways from this talk today will be kind of a deep drill down into the report server architecture changes. So we've made a lot of changes on the report server side in this July CTP, and we're going to be taking a good look at those. In addition, there have been a number of changes to the report processing engine. We'll also delve into some of those changes. And throughout the presentation, we'll kind of be discussing the impact of these architecture changes to you as customers and explaining their impact on existing applications that you have today. In general, the overall takeaway is that a lot of the things that we focused on in Reporting Services 2008 has been to really improve the functionality, scalability, deployability, and reliability of the software so you can confidently deploy this in your enterprise environment. So the first thing that we will talk about today is some of the changes that we made to the report server service. So these are the server components of the report server. This slide here is a quick diagram of the service architecture in Reporting Services 2005. If you're a current user of Reporting Services, you're well aware that the web service aspect of Reporting Services is all hosted, it's handled by Internet Information Services, and that IIS is required on server machines in order to serve out that service. You can see by the dashed lines here that the Windows service, which is responsible for handling things such as scheduling and subscriptions and delivery, exists within a separate process boundary than the web service components up at the top there. This presented a number of unique problems to customers and to IT administrators when deploying and maintaining reporting services, and we've made some changes there. And moving on, we'll discuss those a little bit further. So, in 2008, as you'll see in the July CTP, the report server is no longer hosted in Internet Information Services. Rather, the report server 2008 uses http.sys directly. There is no longer a dependency on Internet Information Services on the report server. In order to serve out the web requests, SQL Server's internal networking stack is used. The functionality previously provided by Internet Information Services is now replaced by SQL Server internal components. And there's a list of those here: SQL OS, SQL CLR, and the SQL Network Interface. One of our broad-reaching design goals for doing these changes was to not break anything. We've put a lot of work and a lot of thought into these changes that we've done to make sure that your applications continue to work exactly how they've worked before, with minor improvements when you upgrade to 2008. We'll be talking about some upgrade scenarios a little bit later on, and we'll be getting into some of the major changes in architecture and explaining how they impact you. So one of the major questions that we get is, why do we bother to remove IIS? Quite simply, it was extremely complex at times to deploy and maintain, and also it's sometimes blocked by enterprises. So there's a lot of complexity in Internet Information Services and a lot of settings that can impact reporting services. Other applications hosted in IIS, if you have other websites running on the same machine, also could impact reporting services. Furthermore, it required a two-service model. So there was a lot of work and a lot of pain that customers felt when configuring these two services, kind of keeping the IIS settings and the reporting services settings in sync in such a way that they work nicely together. And this caused problems because it was hard to deliver features like resource governing, and communication between the services sometimes causes problems. So there were a number of different things that we wanted to do on the server, and the example here in the slide is resource governing, and using IIS and relying upon IIS to serve out the web aspect of reporting services made providing these kinds of features a little bit more difficult. In addition, the reuse of SQL Server components has great future benefits. We can reuse some of SQL Server's enterprise features, and we can focus additional value on reporting services. And the last point here is that it's very common at times for enterprises to block the coexistence of IIS and reporting services on the same machine. So long story short, we heard you loud and clear with respect to the complexity and other considerations of having IIS and reporting services on the same box, and we've done a lot of work to remove that pain. Here's a quick kind of diagram of the service architecture in 2008, and you can see now with the one dashed box there that all of the components, all the server components now exist within the same process space. Some interesting things to point out here are that ASP.NET and Report Manager and the Report Server web service are all hosted within the same Windows service. This removes a lot of the complexity and a lot of the different configuration settings that one previously had to keep in sync in order to get reporting services to work. So what is the impact on the settings that you have in IIS? So most of the common settings that customers were using in IIS continue to be supported and were re-implemented by our team when we kind of redid the HTTP layer of the product. The ability to bind to specific IP addresses, use host headers, and use multiple ports is preserved. SSL certificates and usages is also preserved, and common security modes, such as the ones listed here, NTLM, Kerberos, Negotiate, Basic, and Custom, are still preserved as well. Tool support is provided for common settings as well. So what that means is that the reporting services configuration tool has been updated to allow you to control these settings from its interface, and the WMI support for the configuration provider has been updated to allow management of the new features as well. IIS settings that were previously not supported are now enforced. For example, anonymous authentication, digest authentication, and client certificates. Even though RS no longer has a dependency on IIS, they still can continue to coexist on the same machine. So reporting services in IIS 6 and above use the same network stack, and they do not conflict on most operating systems. And in fact, they can even share a single port if need be. There is one exception to this coexistence, and that is in the Windows XP 32-bit while running IIS 5.1. It's the only exception here, and the exception that you need to remember is that they must have different ports. So URL reservations are the way that URLs can be reserved by reporting services in HTTP.sys. IIS makes weak wildcard reservations, and RS makes strong wildcard reservations. So there is a lot of flexibility provided to you in the way that you set up and configure your URLs for reporting services. One of the questions I got here, I see, is that it's from Brian. Does the new RS service require that the SQL Server service both be installed on the same box, or can they be deployed to different boxes? Like reporting services today, the RS service and the SQL Server can exist on different machines. That has not changed. Thank you for the question. Another area in which we've invested a lot in 2008 is in the realm of memory management. So we've heard from customers a lot that when running very large reports, we've heard the customers run reports in the thousands of pages, for example, in PDF. That memory management is a problem. There were oftentimes reports while rendering would simply just get out of memory exceptions because they would consume many, many resources on the server. So as part of the server re-architecturing, we've done a lot of changes to the infrastructure to allow for efficient memory monitoring. Included in that is the way that the server does dynamic self-managing of memory pressure and reduction of throughput in memory pressure situations. In addition to changes on the server, the report processing engine has also had a lot of work done in it to support different kinds of memory management. So for example, the report processing architecture now has a way to kind of reduce memory pressure by spooling out different kinds of operations to the file system in order to adapt to memory pressure. Also, the server engine and the report processing engine can communicate with each other and receive memory events to respond better and more actively to low memory situations. The end result of this is that reports that previously would have consumed a lot of memory on the server that would have caused memory out of memory exceptions on the server, that will no longer happen. There are certain cases where reports may take longer to run, but you'll be certain that they will run and not crash. The administrator, with regards to memory management, is allowed to set different targets on the server too, so they can set a minimum and a maximum amount of memory on the server and have control over those kinds of metrics. The minimum threshold defines the amount of memory the server thinks belongs to it, and it's only used if a request needs it. The maximum threshold defines the not to exceed value. There have been a number of changes to the web service API, and the important thing to remember is that old clients will continue to work, and that's if you've accessed the report server through the SOAP API or through URL access. The web service namespaces have small changes. In the July CTP, the namespace version has not changed. There have been several methods added inline, but what you need to remember is that the namespace may be revised in a future CTP, so keep a lookout for that. In 2008, the reporting service's 2000 SOAP endpoint will no longer be supported. On the WMI side, there are a number of different changes to that namespace as well. So we have introduced a new namespace that works better across versions. And you can see on this slide here is just for your reference, if you print out these slides, an example of the way that these namespaces have changed. The 2005 WMI namespace, previously supported in older versions of reporting services, will no longer be supported in 2008. The configuration classes are merged for a better configuration experience as well. So I see there's a number of questions asked here. I'll try to look at some of these questions here. One of the questions is, can you confirm whether the 2008 will work in a reverse proxy environment? That is a question I do not know the answer to. If you'd like to send me your question offline, my email is chris.baldwin@microsoft.com. I'll be glad to forward that on to the appropriate person and get you an answer for your question. Always feel free to send me an email for these kinds of questions. Okay. So moving on. The tools for working with reporting services have also been revved in 2008. So Report Manager is the end user interface to reporting services and is targeted at end users and their kind of act of consuming reports. You can manage reports within the report server namespace, and that means tasks such as creating folders, uploading reports, setting data sources, and things of that nature. We've added the ability to manage models to Report Manager, and the Report Manager, as you saw on the architecture slide, is now hosted in the report server process. It's not a completely separate web application hanging off of IIS. Management Studio is the tool that is targeted at report server administrators' ability to manage the server. Through this tool, job and role definition management can be done. The Management Studio tool is usable in native and SharePoint integrated modes. So the configuration tool has many changes to reflect the removal of IIS, as I mentioned before. Things that were previously had to be done in IIS to web kind of configuration options can now be done through the configuration tool. The command line tool, such as rs.exe, has not changed. So moving on, we'll take a look at some screenshots of the new configuration tool. Some of the new tools UI. So right here you see a screenshot of the Report Manager, and you can see this is the UI now for performing configuration settings on models. This is a screenshot of the new configuration tool. There have been a number of usability kinds of improvements here, and you can see kind of the common options there for configuring the service account, web service URL, database encryption keys, and Report Manager URL. For configuring URLs in the configuration tool, this is a screenshot of the URL reservation tool here. So this is the interface that you would use to bind URLs to reporting services. This is the screenshot here for creating and configuring report server databases. And finally, this is the change database wizard. So we've provided a wizard for you to be able to to ease the kinds of common maintenance things that one would need to do, such as changing the database. So now that we've kind of had a view of the architecture changes on the server, we'll get into the deployment and upgrade story here. So at a glance, These are the kinds of scenarios that are supported when deploying reporting services 2008. So we've taken a lot of special care to make sure that applications built for reporting services 2005 and 2005 SP2 will continue to work. Applications built for 2000, there are some special considerations there. As I mentioned previously, the RS-2000 SOAP API is no longer supported in 2005. However, any applications that access the server through URL access will continue to work. RS-2005 and 2000 RDL are supported through an upgrade scenario. So what that means is the report server in 2008 does not store RDLs previously created in older versions. Rather, if you upload a 2005 or a 2000 RDL to the server, they will upgrade on the fly, and the designer component with the July CTP can only create and edit 2008 RDLs. So while you can still upload 2005 and 2000 RDLs to the server, the report designer can only work with 2008 RDLs. An RS database hosted in SQL Server 2005 will continue to work. However, a database hosted in 2000 will not. The VS 2005 report viewer controls, which were distributed through Visual Studio, which worked with reporting services 2005, will continue to work with 2008. When I get to the section on report engine changes, I'll talk a little bit about what we've done in that realm to make your application backwards compatible with the 2005 report viewer controls. SharePoint integration and SharePoint v2 web parts will be supported. So when upgrading to reporting services 2008, upgrading in most scenarios are supported. When you perform the upgrade, a lot of your changes, a lot of the configurations settings that you've done in IIS will be preserved. The configuration state, as best as possible, of the report server when you upgrade will be preserved when moved over to the new architecture. We always recommend running Upgrade Advisor because there are a number of changes to the extension, the extensions layer for example, custom report items and rendering extensions that will need to be addressed when you do the upgrade. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. Detailed guidance on upgraded will be provided in the future. There's not a lot there right now in the July CTP, but look forward to that in the future. For upgrading supports, the 2008 server will support running legacy RDL. So by legacy RDL, we mean reports created in 2005 RDL and 2000 RDL. The reports, when you upgrade the report server, those reports will continue to run. There will be no need to redeploy them manually. They will upgrade on the fly. The designer in 2008 has partial support for legacy RDL. By that we mean if you try to open a 2000 or a 2005 RDL in the 2008 designer, there will be a one-way conversion to 2008 RDL. So basically what that means is the designer can open 2008 RDLs as long as they've been converted. Using the 2008 designer, you will not be able to save legacy RDL formats, just 2008 formats. In order to generate 2005 or 2000 RDL, you'll need to use a previous version of the report design tool. 2008 RDL will not work with SQL Server 2005, just as 2005 RDL did not work with 2000. The SQL 2005 report engine is deprecated with the new report engine that we are providing in 2008. However, any snapshots that you have created in 2000 or 2005 will continue to work with SQL 2008. So there are a number of different questions I see here. I'll kind of get to the questions towards the end of the presentation just to kind of make sure we have enough time to get through all the slides. Upgrading the report server database happens automatically the first time the user is connected to the 2008 server. The data in the report server database is preserved, so any reports, security settings, and snapshots are preserved, as well as snapshots created in Reporting Services 2000. So now a little bit about the report processing engine. So the processing engine is the component on the server which is responsible for kind of processing the data, retrieving the data from the server, performing all your grouping and rendering the reports. So the report processing engine has moved from a kind of entirely instance memory-based model to on-demand processing. If you've ever kind of written a rendering extension and you've exercised what we call the rendering object model, which is the interface to a process report provided from the processing engine, you'll see a lot of changes there in 2008, particularly with the implementation of a hierarchical cursor-based object model. I'll talk more about this in detail in some further slides. On the rendering side, there's a brand new rendering architecture, and as such, all of the rendering extensions have been rewritten, improved in various ways with regard to performance and scalability, and I'll talk more about that as well. So why rewrite the report engine? The big answer here is scalability. The problems that I spoke about earlier with running large reports were a lot more common than we had anticipated in Report Server 2000 and 2005. We heard from many customers that running large reports is a very common scenario, and the server in 2005 just wasn't keeping up with that load. We've made many, many changes in the processing engine to make the engine a lot more scalable. So reports in SQL 2005 are memory bound. In 2005, you probably found that the memory usage is proportional to the size of the data returned in your report. So if your report was many, many pages and returned many, many rows from your data set, memory size would increase proportionally. Large data sets in particular cause out-of-memory exceptions, and certain rendering extensions had particular problems. A number of and in particular, PDF, Excel, and CSV were renderers known to be particularly memory intensive. So these are the things that customers have helped us identify as problem areas in 2005, which we have invested a lot of work in 2008. This graphic here is kind of a brief explanation of the 2005 architecture, and I'll point out some of the key things here. So the thing to look out for here is that when the report is executed, all the data is fetched from the data source. All the calculation is done, and all those calculations and all that data and all of the report is basically stored in memory and exposed through this item here that we call the ROM, which means rendering object model. When you wrote a renderer on top of the ROM, the renderers kind of talk to this ROM, and that's how they get access to the processed and constructed report. All of that was previously held in memory. That proved to be very memory intensive on the server. In addition, on the rendering side, the web forms control and the WinForms control and the print control also required a lot of work to be done on the server. So the way that the web forms renderer worked on the server side was that the HTML renderer on the server would construct HTML and send basically a massive an HTML document down to the web form control and then display it. Likewise for the WinForms control, and likewise for the print control. Well, not HTML, it would be its own respective format. So that really caused a lot additional load on the server. So what have we done in 2008 to address these kinds of things? Firstly, the processing of the data groups here is done in a different place. And you'll see here now that none of the calculations are stored. So this is kind of what we mean by on-demand processing. Instead of storing all of the calculations and all of the groupings and exposing them through a rendering object model, the rendering object model now speaks back to the processing engine, and the calculations are done on demand on the fly. There are a number of different implications to that, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the future, but the thing to remember here is that this really lays the groundwork for extremely scalable processing engine. Another thing that we've done, which was another pain point for lots of customers, is that we've unified the pagination modules for similar kinds of renderers. So we've unified the pagination, for example, between HTML and Excel under what we call the soft page layout module. For hard page renderers, and by that we mean rendering extensions that are bound by physical page size that are designed for print, we've unified the logic for pagination on those renderers under a hard page layout module. And also you'll see CSV and XML under data. There are lots of questions that users have. For example, why do I have a different number of pages in Excel than I do under HTML? Why does Preview show me a different number of pages than in PDF? And by kind of unifying the pagination, we feel like users will get a lot more consistency out of the engine. So another thing that we've done is you can see the lines here have changed between the web forms and the WinForms renderer. So what that means is some of the processing when using the controls has been offloaded from the server down to the client. So I'll give you an example of the print control. So previously, in 2005, the way the print control used to work was that it would make a call directly to the image renderer on the server. The image renderer would read the rendering object model, construct an image file on the server, and stream that image file, that EMF, down to the print control where it would be usable by the user. We've made some changes here so that the print control now receives output directly from the hard page layout module, which sends a stream of instructions down to the print control, and the rendering of the report from the actual construction of the image happens now on the client. And the same goes for the construction of HTML in the web form control and the image in the WinForms control. So by doing that, we've offloaded some of the work from the server and put it onto the client, and the scalability results are that it's greatly improved. For backwards compatibility, I mentioned before that the 2005 controls, the web forms control, the WinForms control, and the print control are still going to be supported. So in order to provide for that, we have built in a backwards compatibility mode into the server, which allows old controls to receive the same output from the server that they did before. So in order to get the benefits of the offloaded rendering, you'll need to upgrade your controls, but if you don't upgrade your controls, they will continue to work exactly as they did in 2005. So some additional benefits of rewriting the processing engine are a couple things I've already commented on here. So number one is layout and pagination consistency. And this is kind of achieved through, we took a good hard look at the pagination for the renderers and unified some of the code underneath those soft page layout and hard page layout modules. The distributed client-server computation is something that you'll get with the 2008 version controls, and that's the kind of offloading the rendering from the server onto the client. And what you'll see here is improved first page response time. We've also done a lot of changes to lay the foundation for lots of future features which people have been asking for a lot, such as bursting, render-dependent behaviors, and editing in rich clients. So we've really laid the groundwork for doing these kinds of things in the future. Additional thing that we've done is we've taken the opportunity, since we were changing around the processing engine so much, to implement what we call Tablix. So Tablix is a brand new data region defined in RDL that you can use in your reports, which is basically a fusion of table and matrix together with extremely increased flexibility. So I'll talk more about that now. So here's kind of a classic example of a table and a matrix. And these objects are available in Reporting Services 2000 and 2005. So the table has a couple common features here. You can see that the parent groups and the child groups are within the same column, and the customer and growth columns here are fixed columns that do not vary by data. The matrix, on the other hand, has a variable number of columns and a variable number of rows depending on your data, and the parent groups and the subgroups are in different columns. And it as well provides for the capability to do subtotaling on the row and column level. A Tablix is kind of a fusion of the features of the table and the matrix together. It allows you to take advantage of the nice features of table and the nice features of matrix together. So a Tablix is basically this. A Tablix is a matrix plus the things that you previously could not do with a matrix before, and a table plus the things you previously could not do with a table before. What this allows you to do is it enables kind of data region layout scenarios that were previously difficult or impossible to do in 2005. So for example, in matrices, you can have multiple parallel row and column members at each level. Each member may be dynamic or static, and you can optionally omit the headers on either the rows or the columns. For tables, you can now have dynamic and nested column groups, so a variable number of columns on tables, the columns are no longer fixed. Multiple parallel row groups, static rows, and optional spanning row headers. So here's an example of kind of your classic example of a table here. And so we have a table header and a table footer, which are common table features, a group header and a group footer, detail rows, and fixed columns. In your matrix here, we have nested groups here, which kind of happen in different columns. Inner static members, so these are kind of fixed sub-members of the dynamic member at the top. So the 2001 and the 2002 are coming from the data, variable based on the data set. and then automatic subtotals as well. So the tablix example kind of provides you the best features of table and matrix together. So here you see dynamic members here. So these members vary by the data in your data set. These are headerless items here, so they do not have headers. And these are static items here. So you're allowed to have static regions on the outside with dynamic members on the inside, which is something that you could not do with a matrix before. So for example, the year and the region columns at the top are fixed, and underneath them, they have 2001 and 2002 and west and east that are variables based on data. There were a number of other changes made to RDL as well. So for example, with the acquisition of the Dundas visualization tools, we are making a lot of changes and improvements into the way that we do charting and reporting services. You'll find that there have been a lot of improvements in the kinds of flexibility, the kinds of aesthetic things you can do with charts. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I just wanted to point out that the RDL for chart has changed. The new tablix structure replaces table, matrix, and list in RDL. So as RDL constructs, table, matrix, and list no longer exist. Underneath the covers, table, matrix, and list are all just kind of different configurations of tablix. In the report design tool, you'll continue to see table, matrix, and list in the toolbox. When you drag one of those from the toolbox onto the surface, you'll get what you previously knew as table, matrix, and list, but under the covers, it'll actually be tablix. So it lets you kind of work with the familiar structures that you know, and also provides you the flexibility to modify that. There have also been a number of different miscellaneous improvements. So one that I'll kind of talk about now is related to what we call keep-together behavior. This was a particular issue for many customers, particularly on subreport. So keep-together to us means that when we're paginating a report, we will try as best we can to keep the entire report item together on the same page and not break it, even though there may be a page break. What that means in a subreport is that if you have kind of a subreport and the physical page ends in the middle of a subreport, that entire subreport will get pushed down to the next page, leaving a gap on the first page. There are some times when this is beneficial, when you actually do want to keep the item together and not have it break, but then there are also times when you would like it to break as well. So previously, subreport had an implicit keep-together behavior where all that was enforced. Now we have added a switch onto the report items that you see listed here so that users can configure that themselves. This was a pain point that I heard about a lot from customers, that they want to be able to control the keep-together behavior on subreports, and we heard you. Another thing to point out is the introduction of the concept of report variables. So variables are a change that were necessary to make to RDL because of the switch to on-demand processing. So now report items are kind of processed as they're displayed in the renderer. This means that if you have a report, for example, and you have a time function in it, such as the VB.NET Now function, and you go to page 2 and then you go back to page 1, you'll see that the expression gets reevaluated each time you go to that page because the processing is done on demand. So we've introduced this concept of variables, which allow you to define expressions in your RDL that are evaluated at most once per report session. So for time-sensitive calculations, an example of that would be, for example, currency conversion values that you wish to remain constant throughout the entire report session. You can define those in your variables and be guaranteed that they'll execute at most once. There have been a number of other changes, including scope previous and other minor structural cleanups. So I spoke a little bit before about the number of changes that are made to chart. I seem to have lost my connection to the live server here. Sorry for the technical difficulty for 1 second. My machine has lost its connection, so I'm just going to switch machines. So hopefully you're now on the slide that says chart examples. And here are some examples of what can be done now with the improvements to reporting services charting that we've made. So I'd like to point out a couple features here. In particular, if you're familiar with reporting services charting, you can see that there's kind of the aesthetic things on the chart that you can do on charts have been improved. So different kinds of colors, different kinds of fonts. For example, on the bottom right-hand side, you can see that there's a forecasted, that region that displays forecasted values kind of a fusion of different chart types. And on the top left, for example, you can see axis breaks, which allow you to visualize your data much more richly. And here's another kind of visual example of some charts here. See, it looks like I'm back in business. I'm going to go back to here. Okay. Sorry for the difficulty there. So this slide here shows another example of the kinds of charts that we want to make available in reporting services. On the rendering side, with regards to rendering extensions, there have been a number of improvements there as well. The CSV rendering extension, which was a data renderer which exported your reports as data and not as layout, has been redefined. The idea of data renderers to us is that your grouped and your processed data can be exported and in a standards compliant way that can be imported by another tool. As such, the data renderers should not convey any kind of report layout at all. The CSV renderer in 2005 and 2000, if you've made a lot of use of it, you probably noticed that it kind of behaves differently in different scenarios. So, for example, in a table scenario, you would get true data output. And in a matrix scenario, you would get kind of a layout output. So you would get text that kind of looked like the matrix, which was not standards compliant and not consumable by external tools. So we've made a lot of changes to the CSV renderer and made it a true data renderer. So now you can reliably use the CSV renderer to do these kinds of data imports. In addition, we've introduced what we call Excel mode to the renderer. So we've heard from customers a lot that the most common kind of use case for the CSV renderer is to export data and import it into Excel. So we've added an Excel mode, which kind of bends the rules of CSV compliance a little bit, but makes the output a lot better for Excel imports. That will be the default mode for the CSV renderer. The inverse to Excel mode is CSV compliant mode. So if you're not importing data to Excel or to a spreadsheet, and you need your data to be compliant to the CSV specification, you can put it into the compliance mode and be sure that your data will be compliant and will be easily importable to Access or other database formats. The Excel renderer in 2005 and 2000 previously did not support nested data regions and did not support nested subreports. So basically, if you had a matrix or a table in 2005 and you tried to nest a table or a matrix within one of that outer table cells, you would just get an error message when you exported the report. You would get a string that said something like, "This is not supported." We have implemented this feature for 2008. This is available in the July CTP, so go test it out. So now you can do nested data regions and nested subreports. Many of the renderers have had a great deal of scalability improvements and also performance improvements throughout. So those problem renderers that I mentioned previously with regards to scalability, and they were PDF, Excel, and CSV, we've done a lot of work in those to help you out in that area. So for rendering API changes, by rendering API is what I spoke about before as the rendering object model. So if anybody out there has written a third-party rendering extension, you've made extensive use of the rendering object model, since that is the way that renderers implement themselves on top of the report processing engine. So the new changes to the rendering object model were required for on-demand report processing. The rendering object model now is a lot more tightly correlated with RDL, so it's a lot closer to the published report definition, and it's now hierarchical and cursor-based, and that's for on-demand processing. One thing to note here is that the rendering object model is not backwards compatible with SQL 2005 or 2000's ROM. So what that means is if you have written a third-party rendering extension on top of the rendering object model in 2005, that will not work with 2008. And this is one of the items here that the Upgrade Advisor will alert you to when you run it. So if anybody has written a third-party renderer and this would be a problem for them, please send me an email and we'll talk about it. We haven't heard of many customers who have actually done this. In addition, the custom report item interface has been modified. So if you've used CRIs in the past, there have been moderate changes to sync with the new ROM, and it is also not backwards compatible, so there will need to be some small changes to CRIs. In addition, just like the case for the rendering object model, if you've done a CRI and you want to talk about the kinds of changes, feel free to send me an email. So that concludes kind of the major sections of what I wanted to talk about. So I guess I'll have a look at the questions now and see if I can address any of those. So the first question is from Scott. It says, with the new architecture, can Report Manager still be hosted on a separate machine from Report Server for single instance configuration? I do not know the answer to that question. I encourage you to send me an email, chris.baldwin@microsoft.com, and I know exactly who to ask, and I will be sure to get the answer to you as soon as possible. The next question here is from, I don't know who that's from, but it says, so does the new architecture of RS lead more to scale up instead of scale out deployment? Up until now, lots of cheap boxes is the feature one big box for RS, assuming no high availability requirements exist. Again, please feel free to send me an email. I'll have to follow up on that question offline. My particular area of experience is, if you haven't noticed, is in the processing engine, not on the server side. So I'll be glad to follow up with my counterpart on the server side and get you the answers to these questions. Again, my email is chris.baldwin@microsoft.com. So the next question is from Frank, and the story is, what is the integration story between SharePoint and reporting services when running in integrated mode? My understanding is that Report Manager went away when you are running in this mode. That is true. When you're running in SharePoint integrated mode, your front-end interface to browsing the report server namespace is SharePoint. The next question is from Vipul. So the question is, Visual Studio 2005 or BID 2005 can still be used to develop and design reports. The answer is yes. If you design a report in 2005 and you try to deploy that to a 2008 server, the report will be upgraded. So you can still use these tools to design reports, but you will not be able to take advantage of the kinds of new features that we're providing in the designers and in the processing engine, such as Tablix. In July CTP, you'll see that there is a new standalone report designer preview, which previews a lot of the new features that we are putting into the report designer, which will be available when 2008 RTMs comes out. The next question is, in SQL 2008 reporting services, do we have an option to export to MS Word? That feature is currently in development. We definitely hope that this feature will make it into 2008. The plan is that it will make it. However, things could change. We're well along the way of completing it, and we hope it will be there. The next question is from Scott, is that, are there any enhancements in parameters? The ability to set validation of parameter values at runtime and dynamic prompt strings. I know that dynamic prompt strings, there have been no enhancements to that area in 2008. I don't know the answer to the ability to set the validation of param values at runtime, so feel free to send me an answer to that offline. Greg B has a question. I've had to do stored procedures to use a table control to get the correct formatting in 2005. So it sounds like this is a case where Tablix would actually help. That's great. Thank you for the feedback, Greg. Next question is from Alex. The question is there a PowerPoint renderer being included? We have done some research on the PowerPoint renderer. We know a couple people have been asking for it. There's no plans at this point to include a PowerPoint renderer in Katmai, but it is on our wish list for a future release. We know it's an issue, and we're kind of working on designs for that component as we speak. I'm really actually very interested to, I work primarily on the rendering side, so I'm really interested to hear about your requirements for a PowerPoint renderer. If you'd like to send me an email and kind of elaborate on your scenario for which you want to use a PowerPoint renderer, that will help us get the right designs and prioritize that feature accordingly. That's great feedback. Thank you. The second other question is from T. Is scheduling for subscriptions still handled by SQL agents? The answer is yes. Another question. Any new features introduced in 2008 to build dynamic reports based on link? There have not been any improvements in this area. Next question is from Thomas. Is there support for international reports so I can write parameter report names and descriptions localized? Localization, there have been no improvements to the supportability of localization features in the processing engine for 2008. So you'll have to keep on using whatever previous techniques you've used for report localization. This is a highly requested feature, which is high at the top of our wish list for a future release. Unfortunately, it's just we don't think it's going to make it in 2008. Another question from Alex. There's a problem in 2005 with data sets using stored procedures with temporary tables. Reporting services cannot see the output fields. Is this resolved? I don't know the answer to that question. Feel free to email me, chris.baldwin@microsoft.com, and I will get an answer for you. Okay, it looks like that's all of the questions that are listed here. I encourage anybody to add more questions as they see fit. Again, to email me directly if you have any follow-up questions or feedback or comments about anything, and I'll be glad to get answers for those questions for you. Thanks very much for attending. Oh, there's one more question here. Oh, thank you. Okay, yeah, it was my pleasure. So shoot me an email if there's anything else I can do for you. Thank you. Greg?
All right, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. That does conclude today's live meeting. So once again, thanks for joining us, and you may now disconnect. Have a great day, everyone.